for joining us. People continue to gather, and so we'll get started in just a moment or two. Okay, well, by my clock, it is 10:30. So although there are still a few folks joining the webinar, why don't we get started? And we promise to start on time and end on time. Welcome everyone to this special installment of Community Solutions Friday webinars. Today we'll be focused on a recent report we released that looks at workforce development funding in Cuyahoga County. Thank you all so much for joining us. And a special thank you to our co-sponsors for today's webinar, Deaconess Foundation. A quick note, you may have seen it already, this webinar is being recorded. The slides and the recording will be available at communitysolutions.com sometime today or early next week. All attendees are muted and off camera for the entire time. So if you have a question at any point in the presentation, please feel welcome to put it in the chat. We will have time at the end for questions. My name is Emily Campbell. I'm the Associate Director and Williamson Family Fellow for Applied Research at Community Solutions. And before we get started, I'd like to formally recognize Ebony Thornton, who is Community Solutions Communication Manager running all the technical aspects of this webinar. We could not do it without you, so thank you, Ebony. I'm really pleased to see some familiar names among the attendees today, and I know that many of you are already familiar with our organization and our work. But for those of you who came to this webinar in other ways, I'd like to tell you a bit about Community Solutions. The Center for Community Solutions is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and research think tank, and you can see our mission here on the screen. We've been headquartered in Cleveland since 1913, and much of our work centers around the health and social service system and issues impacting low-income Ohioans. If you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage you to visit our website or follow us on social media. And if you feel so inclined, please feel welcome to tweet during this webinar. And if you do, please tag us. You see our handle there on the screen. I'm so pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Sarah Hudasek, by Lissy Rand from Deaconess Foundation, and by Kathy Belk, who's the president and CEO of Deaconess. So I'll turn the microphone over to Kathy now. Kathy, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. This is Kathy Belk. Great to see you all today, and thanks for attending. I have the great pleasure every day of working with my colleague, Lissy Rand, who is also on the video, at least for the next 5 minutes. And thank you so much for joining us today, with an extra special thanks to the Center for Community Solutions. There are very few partners in the community who can do the kind of work that they do. I am new to understanding all their capacities and capabilities, and this has been a delight. So thank you very much, Ebony, Emily, and Sarah. I wanted to give you a bit of background about the Deaconess Foundation. And I wanted to start with this, which is, what do I think about every day in the role that we have here? And that is to have the very, very best talent pool in the country. In fact, what you see is a desire for Greater Cleveland's abundant and industrious talent pool to be the most qualified and most diverse in the Midwest, which will enable us to fill all the jobs that we have today and the jobs for tomorrow. And that will not only attract businesses and make sure that businesses that are in our region will grow, but it will also attract people, young people, older people, people with all kinds of backgrounds who will know that they have the best career opportunities here in Greater Cleveland. So that is what gets me up every day, what makes me super excited, and gives you some context then for what Deaconess Foundation does and why we wanted to work together with the center for this report. So why don't we go to the next page? So the Deaconess Foundation has a mission to help people in need build careers that sustain themselves and their families. And I wanted to highlight just a couple pieces of this mission, because as you know, with mission statements, every word has been selected really carefully. The first is to help people in need. And the people we think about here are those who have had experiences in their lives which create barriers to employment. And there's all kinds of experiences those could be. Those could be circumstances under which they've grown up. It could mean they haven't been able to complete a high school degree or other education. It could be that somebody wants a career, but they haven't been able to obtain all the technical skills that they need for that particular career. It could be because they just need childcare. It could be because they have been incarcerated. There's all kinds of experiences that can occur to somebody or happen to somebody in their life that makes it difficult for them to have a job. The second part, building careers, is also very important, because this means we care not only about somebody getting their first job, but also somebody getting their second job or their third job and their fourth job. This is about a career, not just a job. And then the last point here is sustain them and their families. This is very specifically referring to how much money you can make and what it takes to be able to live with a family here in Greater Cleveland. And the truth is, it takes $22.80 an hour. I mean, really, probably more. But the analysis is at $22.80 an hour, or about $45,000 a year, you can support a family of 4. So you really need to be on a career path so that you can make that much money. And that's how these elements of our mission really come together and make sense for us. So let's go to the next slide. So there's a word in the systems about how you help people build these careers that we're talking about that sustain themselves, and that's called workforce development, in case that language isn't familiar to you. And Deaconess Foundation funds nonprofits that are working in this workforce development system. Nonprofits who are training people, who are eliminating those barriers, providing career awareness and experience, that kind of thing. And right now, there's no fewer than 10,000 open jobs, and there's thousands of people who want to fill them. So currently, we have a lot of work to do to achieve that vision that we talked about, and to make sure that people who want work have everything that they need so that they're able to build that career path and sustain their family. And in this workforce development system we talked about, the public sector, that is the government, provides really significant funding to support this work. And you'll see as we go through the discussion today how significant the public sector funding is for the work. If we, meaning if Greater Cleveland wants more of this funding, or we want more flexible funding or a broader use of all of the funding, then we would move forward with advocacy. Those are activities which aim to influence policymakers or public sector funds. And to have an advocacy agenda, you sort of have to understand all of the mapping of those public sector funds. Where do they come from? What's their objective? What are their limitations? So at the Deaconess Foundation, this really matters to us. And that was the core reason why we commissioned this study from the Center for Community Solutions. Of course, we also wanted to understand who are the other funders, what's the percent of their money, and what's it going for. So that is the rationale for some of the things we wanted to understand. And you see that identified here on this page about the questions. So in the webinar today, you're going to learn some of the answers to some of those questions, some ideas for the things that we can do to secure more funding or to use our funding differently. And we'll be able to compare our system a little bit to other systems. So I'm glad you're here to learn more about this. But I'm also glad that you're interested in the workforce system overall. And so this is my shameless plug that if you want to continue to keep abreast of this work, to understand what Deaconess is working on and what many of our other partners and others in the ecosystem are working on in order to continue to make our workforce systems and programs even stronger, even better, and have even more capacity, follow us. see all these different places that we're putting out information. We'd love to continue to have a conversation with you. So with that said, I again want to thank Ebony, Emily, and Sarah, and I'm going to turn it back over to them for our discussion on this research.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, so much for that. So we're going to start really digging in. We're here today to talk about information from the recent report that Kathy mentioned, which was commissioned by Deaconess Foundation. It builds off of previous research that the Center for Community Solutions did for Seattle Jobs Initiative and Cuyahoga County Job and Family Services that was published in 2017. Some of you may be familiar with that previous work, which was called the Cuyahoga County Workforce Development Map. But that was done for a different purpose than those things that Kathy mentioned. The workforce development system exists to ensure that adults have the skills needed to obtain and maintain employment, and that employers can find qualified workers. So there's supply and demand aspects to the workforce development system. Common services within this system include job preparation and readiness, training, job search and employment services, post-secondary education and credentialing, job matching and career planning, addressing barriers to employment and employer services. Workforce development really bridges education and economic development, and it is a varied and complex system which spans all levels of government. So the Workforce Development and the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, is the main source of dollars for workforce development. The U.S. Government Accountability Office identified 9 federal agencies that support workforce development via 43 funding streams. So lots of different parts of government have their hands in workforce development. The same is true at the state level. The state of Ohio identified 17 state agencies which offer nearly 200 programs related to workforce development. And we know that there are activities related to job preparation that permeate almost every part of Cuyahoga County government. Frankly, this report looks at only a small portion of that. Even though we identified more than $41 million in federal, state, local, and philanthropic funding for workforce development programs in Cuyahoga County in 2019, there are many, many more dollars which support people in obtaining and maintaining employment and support employers in finding qualified workers. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are frankly excluded from the analysis. We looked at funding for 2019. That was the last year which we're reasonably confident that we could capture all of the funding. So of course, the significant amount of dollars that have come into Ohio because of pandemic recovery aren't included at all. We're definitely looking pre-pandemic. You will notice immediately that the list of what is not included is larger than the list of what is included, and we had to set the boundaries somewhere. We fully recognize that lots of the education system, especially in high school and colleges, is focused on career preparation, but we excluded general education funding. A great way to think about this is to think about funding for Cuyahoga Community College, or Tri-C. I think everyone would agree that the community college is a very important anchor institution in our workforce development system, but not everything Tri-C does is really considered workforce development for the purposes of our analysis. So Tri-C's total budget was $319 million in 2019. And we don't include the money from Tri-C's property tax levy or from Pell Grants that help Tri-C's students afford their education. Pell Grants topped $32 million in 2019. And that's just one example of what we mean by support for individuals directly. Many, many people use their own savings to pay for part of their higher education, their training, their credentials, and we frankly have no way to capture that. Tax credit for employers, I think, is self-explanatory. We don't include those. And we know that many, many social service programs incorporate an employment or job placement component, but we weren't able to quantify that with any degree of certainty from readily available information. I think the biggest place that you'll notice that impact missing is when we think about Cuyahoga County's investment of local dollars into workforce development. Money for the Workforce Development Board that flows through the county is really obvious and easy to see, but nearly all aspects of the activities of Cuyahoga Job and Family Services, and really almost everything the Department of Human Services does, and a lot of the Department of Economic Development, includes job readiness and employment services. You know, think of things like fatherhood, homelessness, reentry, they all have a job component, but we were not able to tease that out. So we really think that the county investment is probably undercounted in this analysis. And of course, if we couldn't figure out how much money was coming to the Cuyahoga County community, we didn't include it. Sarah will talk a lot more about this when we get to the state funding information. All right, so that's what's not in. What is left? We looked at dollars supporting employment and training services, which usually go to organizations and institutions clearly identified as part of the workforce development system. We paid careful attention to those things which are included in Ohio's combined workforce plan. And ultimately, we traced $41 million coming into Cuyahoga County in 2019. And this is how it breaks down. We'll talk in more detail about this in a moment, but this pie includes 6 federal programs, 4 state programs, 1 county line item, and a host of philanthropic funders. To collect our data, we relied on usaspending.gov. We looked at Ohio's open checkbook. We looked at Cuyahoga County's open checkbook. We used Candid's foundation maps and other annual reports and budget documents to be able to identify and trace these dollars. So Cuyahoga County government is the recipient of millions of dollars in state and federal funds, which it uses to pay for workforce development services, mostly through the Ohio Means Jobs, Cleveland Cuyahoga County One Stop, and at other service providers. What you see on your screen is a really important part of our analysis, which I want to walk through. It is, of course, in the report. Some federal dollars pass through Ohio's state budget and are allocated to counties. Along the way, the state may chip in some of its additional resources. Sometimes they have to because matching dollars are required to draw down the federal funds. We see that in programs like ABLE. Other federal funds go to the state of Ohio and kind of stay there. They stay with state agencies who provide services more directly to Ohioans across the state. This is really how the vocational rehabilitation dollars work. Then we have other federal funds which go directly to service providers. Cuyahoga County spends some of its general revenue funds and some of its levy dollars to fund workforce development. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is that every step of the way, these dollars come with strings, with requirements and with regulations that have to be followed. And each level of government can add to those. For example, even though WIOA dollars aren't originated here locally, local government can and does have some say over defining how those dollars are used, and this prevents opportunities for some advocacy. Our analysis didn't reveal any large untapped pots of workforce development money. The Cuyahoga County community appears to be leveraging dollars effectively. Is there an opportunity to grow some of the existing pots? Probably. But we didn't find really anything that Cuyahoga County wasn't taking advantage of. So from that aspect, we were pleased to see that our community is really doing quite well in terms of identifying and obtaining funding for workforce development, the available funding for workforce development, I should mention. So we're going to walk through some of the largest funding sources, starting, of course, with the federal government, and where else do we need to start but the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. WIOA is about half of the federal dollars that we identified that were flowing to Cuyahoga County entities. It's the largest piece of the largest slice of that pie. Here you can see the total amount for all of Ohio of WIOA formula funding for youth, adults, and dislocated workers. And you'll immediately notice that those figures are going up over the course of time. WIOA is essentially a block grant, which is meant to enable the workforce development system to respond to regional labor force and economic needs. I'm very much oversimplifying this, but there's lots of information about WIOA out there. The money flows from the federal government through the state budget and ODJFS's, or the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services Office of Workforce Development, then through the county budget to the Workforce Development Board, to Ohio Means Jobs, Cleveland Cuyahoga, and to local providers. So lots of weaving through the system. There are restrictions on the use of these funds, which limits flexibility for local entities. When we look across the state at the allocation of WIOA funding to Ohio's 20 workforce investment areas, of which Cleveland Cuyahoga is one, we see that Cuyahoga is doing pretty well. In fact, the local workforce investment area is the second largest recipient of funding from WIOA in Ohio. The first is Area 7, which covers 43 counties and 11 regional groups. So covering a huge swath of the state. And that's really the reason that their total allocation is higher. So our workforce investment area is by far the largest of the 7 single county workforce development areas in the state in terms of the amount of WIOA funding which is coming into our area. The use of WIOA funds is governed by federal law and regulations. The priorities for that funding is incorporated into each state's comprehensive or integrated workforce plan. Ohio has what's called a combined workforce plan because it goes beyond WIOA to include other sources of funding for workforce development activities, but there are programs which could be part of Ohio state plans, but aren't currently included. We talk about this in the report, and it may be an opportunity to even better integrate some of the different programs and systems that interact with the workforce development system. You know, things like unemployment insurance, employment and training activities carried out by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, community service block grant funding, and the Second Chance Act are all options for the state to include that they have not included yet. Right now, Ohio is utilizing Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, and Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF funding, to directly fund workforce activities and employment training services, but it's not currently part of the state's workforce plan. So the current plan covers 2020 through 2023. The development of that plan will probably start next year, and here's why it matters. The state combined workforce plan is the document which outlines priorities for Ohio's use of WIOA and other resources. And so it's an opportunity to ensure that state priorities and activities are aligned with local needs. So, you know, there may be opportunities coming up to have some discussions about where Ohio should focus those efforts, especially as we enter the recovery period after the COVID crisis. Another thing I want to touch on is waivers. So federally funded programs always have restrictions, but states or local communities can seek to waive some of those requirements and use the money in different ways. Where we at Community Solutions most often talk about waivers is within the Medicaid program, but Ohio has sought and obtained waivers in WIOA as well. In fact, the state got 4 separate waivers to be able to implement the CCMEP program, the Comprehensive Case Management and Employment Program. You can see what those waivers are in the report. I'm not going to read them, but there are other waivers which other states currently have, which allow them greater flexibility that Ohio has not sought. In this area, I'd suggest looking at what Colorado and Illinois are doing because they seem to have more waivers total and more unique waivers than some other states. So WIOA is the big one. Again, it's the largest part of the largest slice of the workforce development pie. But there are other federal funds which we could trace to Cuyahoga County. These are just a few of the 43 federal funding streams which pay for workforce development, and they're explained in the report. A couple very quick highlights. The Adult Basic Literacy Education, or ABLE program, is Title III of WIOA, but it comes through the Department of Education. Sarah will talk more about this because the state puts in General Revenue Fund dollars as the required match. In 2019, the federal portion which came to Cuyahoga counties was about $2.3 million. The ABLE, or Aspire, Ohio rebranded, the providers in Cuyahoga County are Tri-C, Cuyahoga County Public Library, and Polaris Career Center. Career and technical education is the most direct connection between what we usually consider to be education and workforce development. It funds what it sounds like, career tech programs. They used to be called VOTEC. Also known as the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, nearly $19 million in 2019 went to 8 school districts and 2 career centers for secondary education programs. We exclude that because it falls into that secondary education, but we do count the more than $5 million that came to Tri-C, Polaris, and Cuyahoga Valley Career Center. Sarah will talk about vocational rehabilitation. The Jobs for Veterans State Grant is a formula grant allocated to state, and it funds local veterans employment representatives. Locally, they work out of OMJ. It's $6.5 million statewide, but we weren't able to tease out how much of those activities come into Cuyahoga County. We can talk about CSEP, the Senior Community Service Employment Program. It's required to be included in the state workforce plan, but is authorized and funded through the Older Americans Act. So is part of the aging system, the aging services system. Training and subsidized employment for low-income people over the age of 55. There are national providers that receive money and provide services in Cuyahoga County, AARP, Vantage Aging, and National Center in Caucason Black Aged. But all three serve communities across the country, and we could not identify how much was helping Cuyahoga County residents. SNAP Employment and Training, or SNAP ENT, is probably the biggest change since our report in 2017. Cuyahoga County has implemented a SNAP ENT program, which reimburses costs associated with providing employment and training services to SNAP recipients. There's 9 authorized providers in Cuyahoga County, and in 2019, it paid for almost $300,000 in workforce services. Competitive grants are just what they sound. They're competitive. Sometimes they're pilot. Sometimes they're other types of grants. Communities can or agencies can apply. You may be selected. In 2019, there were 2 competitive Department of Labor grants that were going towards employment for a total of $3 million. These amounts rise and fall depending on what's available and how successful local entities are at receiving those awards. TANF block grants provide cash assistance via Ohio Works First. But it's relevant for our discussion here because they run WEP programs, workforce experience programs for TANF recipients, and also Ohio uses some of its TANF dollars to fund the CCMEP program. And finally, we had large infusions of dollars through the CARES Act and through the American Recovery Plan Act, or ARPA. It's one-time funding, covers a variety of purposes. Right now, the county and communities across the state are working to figure out how they're going to use their ARP dollars. One example, Ohio devoted $15 million in federal COVID-19 relief dollars to the Ohio to Work program, connecting individuals with career coaches, support services, rapid training. Locally, Magnet was part of that pilot program. Okay, so that's federal. A lot of information so far. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Hudasek, who's part of Community Solutions Policy Team. She's stationed in our Columbus office. And so Sarah, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. Are you able to hear me? Great. Let's start by laying out the state landscape. So according to Ohio's combined state plan, there are 17 agencies which offer nearly 200 programs related to workforce development. And these agencies and programs are all convened under Ohio's Office of Workforce Transformation, which is led by Lieutenant Governor John Husted. So to collect state funding information, we analyzed Ohio Legislative Service Commission documents and identified 11 line items in the Ohio operating budget dedicated to workforce programs. To then identify allocations to entities in Cuyahoga County from these line items, we examined spending data that was available in Ohio's online checkbook. And if you go to the next slide, Emily, we can see that state investments in workforce development have been growing steadily over the past several years. Ohio's increased investments in workforce development and related programs over the past few years follows a national trend, and legislators' willingness to commit more state dollars indicates strong support for workforce development efforts, especially those focused on preparing Ohioans for in-demand careers. Now, on the next slide, we can talk about how there's a few different pots of money that workforce funding can come from. Ohio's General Revenue Fund, or GRF, is state money, and it's the largest funding source for state agencies and public services. It's funded majority from sales and income tax, and much of Ohio's GRF spending on workforce development represents matching funds, allowing the state to draw down federal grants. There are also some special revenue funds, which include sources such as casino licensing dollars, which are used to pay for various programs under the Ohio Department of Development. The Ohio budget also allocates a significant amount of federal pass-through funding, which, as Emily mentioned earlier, is federal funding received by the state and then reallocated to local governments and programs. For the purposes of this analysis, though, we chose to focus on GRF line items alone because they represent state investments in workforce development. And today we'll talk about line items that are funded through the Ohio Departments of Education, Higher Education, the Department of Development, and Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities Agency. So on the next slide, the first item we'll look at today is the Career Technical Education Enhancement line item, which is funded through the Ohio Department of Education. Now, this item supports competitive grants to tech prep consortia. It provides support for career planning via the Ohio Means Jobs website, and also supports the Jobs for Ohio's Graduates program. In 2019, more than $737,000 came to Cuyahoga entities through this line item, and recipients of that funding included Tri-C, Cleveland Metropolitan School District, Polaris Career Center, Cuyahoga Valley Career Center, and 10 other school districts. In the final budget that wrapped up earlier this month, $14 million will go to this line item in fiscal year 2022, and $18.3 million will go to this line item in fiscal year 2023. The state line item for adult basic literacy education is funded through the Ohio Department of Higher Education, which in the line item is still identified using the acronym BOR from the old name Board of Regents. And this is the state match for the federal program of the same name, like Emily mentioned. And in Ohio, this program is also known as Aspire. So adult basic literacy education, or ABLE funding, supports adult courses in basic math, reading and writing skills, workplace literacy, life skills, family literacy, English for speakers of other languages, and high school equivalency test preparation. In fiscal year 2019, ABLE funding came to Tri-C, Cuyahoga County Public Library, and Polaris Career Center. And in the recently passed budget, $7 million was allocated for this line item each year of the upcoming biennium. Ohio technical centers throughout the state provide adult career technical training programs and adult workforce education. And this line item is funded through the Ohio Department of Higher Education. In Cuyahoga County, this item provided state funds to Cuyahoga Valley Career Center and Polaris Career Center. And the final budget allocated $21.3 million of this line item in fiscal year 2022 and $21.8 million in 2023. Now, providing the state match for federal vocational rehabilitation funding, the Services for Individuals with Disabilities line item funds programs that help individuals with disabilities prepare for and obtain employment. OOD is the primary provider of vocational rehabilitation services in Ohio, and they utilize staff of OOD at local offices throughout the state. So because of this, only a small portion of these funds flows through county governments or local agencies. And the final budget funded this item $18.4 million each fiscal year of the biennium. So in these final slides, we're going to discuss some line items that weren't included in our larger analysis because, as Emily mentioned earlier, we can't narrow down what funding came to Cuyahoga County using readily available sources. And this could either be because these programs help individuals cover the cost of their employment and training and are provided directly to individuals, or because they're newer funding mechanisms that were implemented after 2019. So we'll cover some of these briefly, but more information on each of these can be found in the report. So incumbent workforce training vouchers. This line item was funded using money collected from casino licensing fees, and it reimbursed employers for a portion of the cost to train certain categories of existing workers up to $4,000 per employee. Beginning in 2020, though, money for this program was no longer appropriated, and this line item has since been discontinued. Now, Ohio's primary need-based financial aid program is the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, which is funded through the Ohio Department of Higher Education. Awards are based on the remaining cost of attendance after a student's expected family contribution and federal Pell Grant are applied to the charges for the student's educational program. And support for this program is purposely limited for students attending community colleges because the combined family contribution and Pell Grant amount often exceeds the cost of covering community college tuition. So because of that, the largest recipients of this grant in Cuyahoga County were Cleveland State University, Baldwin Wallace University, Notre Dame College, and John Carroll University, and only about $29,000 from this line item went to Tri-C. So there's also no way, though, to know whether the students who benefited from this grant are from Cuyahoga County or reside in Cuyahoga County after graduation. So that's why this was excluded from our analysis. And you also see more information about the technology maintenance and operations line item in our report. On the next slide, the program and project support line item through the Ohio Department of Higher Education awarded $200,000 in fiscal years 2021 and 2022 to Magnet's Early College, Early Career Program, and $125,000 each year to Seeds of Literacy. This line item was excluded from our analysis because it's often used for earmarks for higher education programs, and so it varies each biennium in total allocation and recipients. Beginning in 2018, several previously separate GRF line items were combined into the adult education programs line item, and these programs assist people who dropped out of high school who are seeking to obtain a high school diploma or equivalent certificate. In Cuyahoga County, Tri-C was a major beneficiary of these funds in fiscal year 2019, and Cuyahoga Valley Career Center and Polaris Career Center also received funding, but at a lower amount than Tri-C. Students and workers who are pursuing in-demand jobs who enroll in short-term training courses in specific industries can access grants through the Tech Cred program. Now, under this GRF line item that's listed here, no additional funding was allocated to Tech Cred in the final budget, but instead a new line item was created, which is listed there in the bullet point. And this program was funded through the Ohio Incumbent Workforce Job Training Fund instead. And this new line item allocated $33.3 million for fiscal year 2022 to Tech Cred and $25 million for fiscal year 2023. For industry recognized credentials for high school students, this is funded through the Ohio Department of Education, and it provides payments directly to school districts whose students earn an industry recognized credential or certification. Districts can receive $1,250 for each credential a student earns from a list of priority credentials via the Workforce Incentive Program. And although the program was funded beginning in fiscal year 2020, because of the pandemic, implementation was delayed and some of the appropriation was reallocated to help balance the state budget. In this most recent budget process, though, money was reallocated to the program and $20.5 million was allocated for each fiscal year of the upcoming biennium. There's also additional information on the STEM Public-Private Partnership Program line item in our report. So some overall state takeaways. So as Emily mentioned, there is an opportunity for Ohio to create a more comprehensive state combined workforce plan by integrating other non-WIOA required programs into the planning process. And there's more detail on this in the report as well. And connecting education and workforce systems. As we've seen today, significant funding for workforce development is spread across state departments. There are many non-WIOA dollars that flow through the Ohio Department of Higher Education, and many other states have connected the workforce and education systems by including an education representative on the state workforce board or expanding workforce board responsibilities. And there are also opportunities to advocate for increased state funding. Currently, state policymakers are focused on getting Ohioans back to work as the pandemic subsides. And Lieutenant Governor John Husted is a vocal proponent of economic development and leads the governor's office of workforce transformation. The governor's executive budget proposal earlier this year made additional investments in workforce development, and then state legislators later increased some line items even further. So this might present, a unique policy window to successfully argue for even more state funding of workforce development. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Emily to discuss local investments in workforce.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So a quick note at this point, please feel free to type your questions in the chat or in the questions. As you'll notice, we answered some of them, or I answered some of them while Sarah was talking, and are happy to continue to answer more, but we will have additional time for questions at the end. So we've reached close to home. We've gone through federal, gone through state. Now we're going to look at local funding. There are two main buckets of local dollars for workforce development that we looked at. One is Cuyahoga County government resources that come from their general revenue fund or levy funds. And then we also considered philanthropy to be local dollars. There are, of course, some foundations from outside the region which fund workforce development that's happening in Cuyahoga County. But as you'll see in a moment, the largest philanthropic funders are homegrown. So we lump those in with local funding. Cuyahoga County's funding for workforce development, as I mentioned at the top, was a little bit difficult to tease out. And we know that we are missing some things, just like we know that there are a number of other federal programs that we weren't able to include in our analysis. So one of the things we did was took a look at funding for two of the real anchor institutions in Cuyahoga County that are providing lots of workforce development services towards employment and Youth Opportunities Unlimited. In the workforce development system, Cuyahoga County is in some ways both a funder and a provider. Many workforce development programs in Ohio are federally funded, state sponsored, and county administered. We see this time after time in health and social service programs. So Cuyahoga County government is responsible for utilizing those federal, state, and local resources to contract for services or provide workforce employment and training services for residents. The activities which could be considered workforce related are peppered throughout county government. We have WIOA and Skill Up Business Advisory Services. Public benefits have workforce requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents, or the ABOD population. Those are all part of Job and Family Services. And then we have those employment and job training services, job readiness programs, which are components of a bunch of other county agencies. Tracing these investments, again, basically impossible given readily available information, because we couldn't separate the dollars devoted to those workforce activities from the rest of what those programs do. So we know we had a bunch of money left out. In the pie, you'll see $1 million from the county. Those are county funds devoted directly and clearly to workforce development. It came out of the General Revenue Fund until 2019, and starting in 2020, it's coming out of the Health and Human Service Levy Fund. That's what we were able to see, but there's a lot more to quantify, as I've mentioned. Okay, so we looked at the funding of these two anchor institutions in the workforce system, where a majority of those providers' services focus on employment and training. And again, it's towards employment and Youth Opportunities Unlimited. On the screen and in the report, you can see the total payments from Cuyahoga County to these two entities and how they were classified in Cuyahoga County's open checkbook. It's a lot of federal dollars, where Cuyahoga County has contracted with these providers to fulfill their service provision commitments. These two entities alone, it's $8.5 million that the county is passing out, most but not all of which is in addition to the $13.3 million in WIOA funds that we're about to talk about. I realize that this may be difficult to read, but it's in the report and you can take a look at it. So the boxes to the left show the entities who received at least $100,000 in Cuyahoga County WIOA funding in 2019. And the pie is the categories that total funding fell under. As you can see, most of the WIOA dollars allocated by Cuyahoga County went to contractual services, followed by tuition reimbursement. The biggest recipients of the funding overall were United Labor Agency, Tri-C, City of Cleveland, Towards Employment, Ohio Guidestone, Great Lakes Truck Driving School. WIOA funding going to WIOA looked a little odd, but it appears to be staff-related expenses at Ohio Means Jobs, Cleveland, Cuyahoga. And the $1.2 million going from the county to the City of Cleveland was for non-contract professional and technical services, which we presume are related to the joint administration of OMJ, Cleveland, Cuyahoga County. Before we move to philanthropy, here's what we'd like for you to take away from this. Cuyahoga County is the subrecipient of millions of dollars in federal money that's passed through the state of Ohio. County government in general and the County Department of Job and Family Services in particular is ultimately responsible for complying with the federal requirements and restrictions which come from the higher levels of government. Planning and coordination is a key role of the county in the workforce development system. And so sometimes it's not about where the money comes from, but who gets to decide exactly where it goes and exactly what it is used for. So one more thing, just like how the state has a workforce plan, Ohio Means Jobs has to create what is basically a strategic plan every few years. It's a key responsibility of the workforce development, and that's where local priorities for the use of these dollars are spelled out. So every time that plan is created, there are opportunities to nudge the focus a little bit. You know, for the next plan, I personally hope that it could include more on racial and ethnic equity, on closing gender and wage gaps, and just on inclusion in general. But you know, anytime a plan is written that's going to dictate the priorities for funding, it's an opportunity to talk about what those priorities should be. Okay, leaving Cuyahoga County government, we've reached our final piece of that pie that we shared at the beginning, and that is philanthropic dollars. As we've gone through, the dollars have gotten more and more flexible, you know, starting with federal, through the state, county government. Now we're here in philanthropy. Philanthropy can usually be quite responsive to emerging needs or local conditions. You know, we've seen it very recently with the creation of a very large rapid response fund. It took weeks, maybe even less, to start pushing resources out into the community to address emerging needs. Philanthropy is able to make decisions decisively and push their resources out into the community very quickly when needed. There's a lot less oversight and compliance than with any of the public funding. A couple observations about philanthropy here in Cuyahoga County. Philanthropy is a large piece of the overall pie in workforce development, and it is a larger slice of that pie than it is in most of the other health and social service systems that Community Solutions has examined. Philanthropy totaled more than $15 million in 2019. Over the 4 years we looked at, there were 265 funders who awarded more than 1,500 grants to 228 recipients in Cuyahoga County for a total over those 4 years of $78 million in philanthropic support. We looked at grants where the grantee was located in Cuyahoga County, and there's kind of a big four of philanthropic funders: the Cleveland Foundation, United Way, Deaconess Foundation, and the Fund for Our Economic Future. The Fund for Our Economic Future is also, and United Way, are both also recipients of grants, and they make grants. Let me say that we found some real quirks about how things are classified in our data source, which was Candid, formerly the Foundation Center. Thanks to the advice of Lissy from Deaconess, we were able to untangle some of them, but frankly, it was a little difficult. I mean, a quick example, some of the grants which supported Bloom Bakery, which was an initiative of Towards Employment, were classified as agriculture grants or nature-related grants. I'm guessing because blooms are flowers and, you know, the robots misclassified them. But anyway, as you can see, the Cleveland Foundation was by far the largest contributor of philanthropic funds for employment and training entities in Cuyahoga County. In 2019, the $7.9 million that the Cleveland Foundation invested was more than the total of all the other philanthropic entities combined. The next largest that year was Deaconess, which invested $1.6 million, and St. Luke's did $1 million in grants that year. 15 additional grant makers in 2019 awarded $100,000 or more for the purposes of adult education, vocational education, job services, or employment. So you're probably asking who got the money, but for the sake of time, you're going to have to read the report to find out. So opportunities for investment or additional streamlining, what does it all mean? We identified a couple of what we think of as takeaways after looking at all of this information. I'm going to run through these fairly quickly because we've already talked about most of them. We already covered waivers in WIOA. These are in honestly no particular order. They're in the order that they are in the report. A couple of key takeaways. We don't think there are any large stones which are being left unturned. So the focus should be on using existing resources as efficiently or as effectively as possible. And this leads us right into asking the question of if there are restrictions within WIOA which are significantly holding back what the Cuyahoga County community thinks needs to happen for the workforce development system to be as effective as possible. If so, local advocates can work with the state to seek a federal waiver and do things differently with those funds. It may not be easy, but it is certainly possible. We already talked about expanding the state plan and the importance of engagement in the development of the local plan. Education and workforce are increasingly connected as the lines between secondary and post-secondary education blur. A seamless system which achieves the goal of both workers and employers means starting young and having a consistent path. We believe that one of the best opportunities to grow that total size of that pie comes from state funding. As Sarah mentioned, policymakers have indicated an interest in supporting these programs. And we know that there is a powerful advocate who spends a lot of his time working on workforce development programs in the lieutenant governor, who may just be the next governor of Ohio. So he can be a powerful ally. Of course, has his own priorities of where he would like to see those dollars go. Leveraging flexible resources while coordinating locally is kind of a mouthful. What we mean by this is that local planning processes should utilize the most restrictive funding first, allowing the more flexible funding sources to fill in the gaps. New approaches are probably going to need to be supported by local dollars before being able to be scaled up. There are some really interesting things happening or being discussed in other parts of the state, also some innovative things happening right here at home. Are there things that can be adapted that could be used here? There are also a number of collaborations that seem to have grown and deepened in recent years, and creating an effective workforce development system which is seamless for job seekers and meets the needs of employers requires even more. And finally, we can't have a community solutions webinar without talking about advocacy. We need to identify the targets for advocacy. We list a number of suggestions in the report. The key is to know which level of government controls the funding and where the levers may be. There is a lot of formula funding in workforce development. So the money rolls out based on a formula. Changes to the formula, which could benefit high poverty, high unemployment places with racial and ethnic diversity, could benefit a community like Cuyahoga County without increasing the overall bucket of funding, just seeing that more of that funding comes to our community. And of course, keeping in mind that although it's Cuyahoga County government, which is executing and managing the contracts ultimately for WIOA, most of the dollars come elsewhere with strings attached, and the county is responsible for the compliance. So with that, we'd encourage you to read the report if you haven't already. We're happy to answer questions. I see a couple coming in. To answer what is often the first question, yes, the slides and recording of the webinar will be available on Community Solutions website soon. So thank you to Kathy, Lissy, Sarah, and Ebony for participating in this webinar, and we'll turn it over to Q&A. Please feel free to put things in the chat and in the question and answer. Let me stop sharing here. There's the button. Great. Okay, so one question that I don't know a great answer to, but maybe Lissy or Kathy can speak to it a little bit. The question is, how does Cuyahoga partner with other area counties, for example, Lorain? And it's okay if we're not the right people to answer this.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much for that question. And I think you're maybe talking about the county or maybe talking about broader partnerships. To my knowledge, and I don't have perfect information on this, but my knowledge is that the county governments themselves do talk frequently with each other. I'm not certain if there's a more formal type of collaboration between the two governmental entities. There easily could be, but I'm not familiar with it. With respect to the broader ecosystem, I do think that that same kind of intellectual collaboration is happening a lot. That there's great awareness that county geographies are sort of artificial boundaries to the way people live and work. And so we need to operate as a as more of a region and less of a sort of county structure. So people know each other, people talk a lot. I think the Fund for Our Economic Future is a good example of one formal sort of collaboration table where those relationships and that information can be shared. And then there are sometimes more formal engagements and formal partnerships which are created, but at a systems level, I don't know that those are fully integrated yet, or even if they should be based on how the funding streams are happening. So I would welcome, though, if other people on this webinar have knowledge about this, like jump in on the chat, or we can unmute you, because I certainly am not the expert on that question.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for letting us put you on the spot there. Okay, another question that has come in is, can healthcare be incorporated into Ohio Means Jobs priorities, since it's a problem for employers, workers, and the community? You know, that to me is an interesting thing to bring up, because we often think about healthcare in workforce development as healthcare jobs and healthcare career pathways. It's one of the areas that has a pretty clear career pathway. And I think from reading your question, is that this is a question about healthcare for workers, you know, health insurance, health coverage, those kinds of things. I mean, really anything can be incorporated into the priorities. It's just a matter of picking and choosing what those things are. One of the things that I've taken to saying most recently is that, like, there's money in the possibilities for anything, but not for everything. And so, you know, those questions of job quality with health, which healthcare, health coverage goes right into that, are something that I do think needs to be discussed. Kathy,
Molly,
do you want to jump in?
Well,
Yes.
I actually have just more of a follow-on question to a certain degree. Is WIOA funding, does WIOA funding, would it allow for the funds to be used for something like providing healthcare?
I don't know, frankly. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a provocative idea, because it would certainly be a new use of those federal funds. And I think we'd have to better understand some of those regulations you were talking about in the context of this webinar, about all the layers of regulations, and we'd have to see if that would even fit. Or maybe you advocate for that.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the place to get it in would be in, like, the idea of subsidized employment programs, and maybe that could be a part. I don't know if it's restricted to just wages, it very well may be, but thinking about using the subsidized employment frame and expanding what, you know, employment means for the whole benefit package or compensation package. So great. You know, there have been several questions about specific programs, and I think one of the areas that is kind of causing some consternation, and it really caused some consternation for us, is this idea that there are lots of dollars that are going to individuals to help them on their career pathway or in their career path. You know, Job Corps was something that was mentioned in the chat. Their employer funding that comes through associations or mentorship programs, or businesses or employers paying for some of that credentialing and some of that training. We really had no way to quantify most of those dollars, but it's a really important piece of it. And I know that one conversation that we had with an expert within the community as we were conducting this analysis was a long discussion about Pell Grants, and how, depending on how you look at things, Pell Grants might be the largest workforce development source of money. But we don't usually think of them in quite that way. You know, we think of Pell Grants more in like the scholarship education, how people are paying for things. And so how do these things, I mean, it's all the same people, right? It's the workers, it's the folks that are seeking employment and training, and they're cobbling together things in all different ways. How do we kind of take a broader look at what workforce development means and how that all plays out? I don't have the answers to that, but I think it's an excellent question. Okay, let's see. We're getting some answers in the chat that they don't think that WIOA would allow for use for health coverage, but a funding formula could be weighted. You know, there may be some creative solutions. All right, is there a way to segment the amount of funding going to expand the top of the funnel? In other words, expanding the number of people who have some training and some degrees? Ooh, good question. Not in the way that we did the analysis. You know, there are a number of people in our community that have some college that maybe haven't finished their degree, but are partway on the path. And so I think there is quite a bit of focus, and maybe Kathy or Lissy, you can speak more to this, about getting people back in, you know, either finishing those credentials or finding employment that doesn't require those credentials, kind of make having the job matching be a little bit different, to really focus on the particular skills and experiences needed for the job rather than kind of the piece of paper. Yeah, and a great comment. The Pell Grant question could be more relevant for this analysis if federal policy was changed to allow Pell Grants to cover short-term training. We'll see. Lots of things that I never expected to see at the federal level are happening over the last couple of months. So there may be a lot of opportunities there. Okay, another question has come in. How does local and philanthropic funds focus on strategies that better connect program partnerships between adult education and workforce development and eliminate duplication or disconnected services? Kathy, I feel like this one might be for you.
I'm happy to take a stab at it, but I'm looking for that question again because I was still thinking about the question about the top of the funnel.
Oh, sure. Do you want to talk about the top of the funnel? I'll put it in the chat.
No, I'm happy to answer both. I just need to or to share some comments for both, but wanted to thank you. You posted the other one. I think about the top of the funnel. I think the challenge is that so much of the funding goes to organizations who are doing multiple things. I think that's essentially what you were saying, Emily, is could you segment it only if you knew exactly how much of towards employment's funding goes to expanding training or getting people into certifications as opposed to other things, only if you knew how much of the funding from the Cleveland Site Center was doing that kind of thing. So I think that's the challenge to doing that kind of segmentation. Am I getting that right, centers team?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. So the question in the chat, how does local, I know you just read this, how does local and how do those funds focus on strategies that better connect program partnerships between adult education and workforce development? Oh, okay. I will take a stab at my thoughts on this particular question, which I think is a really good question. But again, I welcome anybody else who's on this webinar and would like to participate in this discussion to jump in on this. So I do believe that among those who are active funders, and you heard some of the names in the presentation today, among those who are active funders, this sort of connection point between education and workforce development is really clear. I think people are well aware that the two systems are deeply integrated. They should be deeply integrated, and the more integrated they can become, the better off it is for the person, because people go through education systems and then we want them to have a career. And, you know, so that's one pathway, not two separate pathways. So I think people really understand that. I think the way the philanthropic community has thought about this, and I'll say that in the structure of a group called the Workforce Funders Group, because there is a philanthropic collaboration called the Workforce Funders Group of people who care deeply about making sure that the workforce system works better and that these kinds of disconnects, like you just pointed out, that they become as seamless as possible. So that Workforce Funders Group has seeded some initiatives which really address this. For example, sector partnerships. Sector partnerships are all about creating a new structure in which employers and education institutions and nonprofits who are training individuals are all coming to the table in a new and different way. So that's one example of how the philanthropic funders are thinking about how to create more connectivity and more seamless work together between all these disparate stakeholders, not just even education and workforce, but the employers too, how to bring everybody to the table together. And I think there's been a lot of progress in that work, but certainly there's much further to go because those systems have been, since their inception, set up separately. So we have to keep working on that.
The only thing that I'll add to Kathy's question is that I think that disconnections between disparate systems like education and workforce development, or adult education and workforce development, are really a fact that we keep continuing to return to across different systems that impact workforce development. And as Lori, who asked this very smart question, well knows, the work to address those has to be collaborative in nature, and it therefore takes a long time. And so Kathy mentioned the Workforce Funders Group and Workforce Connect, but I can think of other examples that are unfolding across the community that I think deserve some attention. Like, for example, CMSD's initiative to connect students to pathways to living wages, like the collaborative outreach project that the Fund for Our Economic Future is working on. And there's several more as well. And so I really applaud Lori for bringing up this question, because I think it really does underscore the issue that where you start still matters, still determines what kinds of services you're going to get and how they'll be paid for. And I think that's a real challenge for us as a community to try to address.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, having looked at lots of different systems, this is not unique to the workforce development system, right? You see it all the time where like people live in families, but things are segmented off. And so the kind of, issue of looking at things more holistically is not easy with the way that these programs and funding streams are set up, but something that I think there's broad agreement could help improve what we see in our community and what our outcomes. And so, it's always a challenge. Question that has come in about sector partnerships. How many sector partnerships have been formed, and are the sectors defined by career groups or industry groups? This is right in Deaconess's wheelhouse.
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at this one. So the sector partnership by definition is defined by the industry or the sector. If you replace the word sector with industry, the idea is that in workforce, if you start with the demand, meaning what are the jobs or what are the jobs within an industry that are in demand, and then you work with the other stakeholders to fill those particular jobs, that's the model that a sector partnership starts with. So it starts at that industry or that sector level, and then it defines several occupations within that industry or sector that are the focus and the need of a great number of employers, and it moves backwards that way. So it starts at that industry or sector level. I think that also, the question was also how many are there? So there are 3 IT, manufacturing, and healthcare that are sort of formal sector partnerships, but there are some what I would call similar designed sector partnerships in other areas. Construction has one, long-term healthcare has one, which are maybe not quite as formal, but are operating with the same principles, which are bring employers together to identify what their needs are and then figure out how you can get that information back to the other stakeholders and better prepare people.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the questions have kind of slowed down. A couple kind of takeaways for some of this information. As you've heard, we fully recognize that this is not a full and complete picture of everything that is happening in our community and all the dollars are coming in. But we do think that it's important to have a sense of the scale and scope of where some of the dollars are coming from, so that those of you who are working in these fields and working on workforce development every day can make some decisions about where to focus your efforts. So, please take the report, use it as you see fit, add to it with your own expertise and kind of go from there. We did get one more question, I think. Did we work with Ohio Means Jobs, Cleveland, Cuyahoga? So we did not work directly with them for this analysis. We were really focused on the amount of information that was what we call readily available. So what we're able to see through the publicly available data sources. But they are the experts in what they are doing. And so would certainly encourage those of you who are interested in really digging in further to reach out to those entities that are providing the services or receiving the funding or passing the funding through to have a better understanding. So Kathy, I don't know if you want to make any concluding comments.
No concluding comments for me other than to thank everybody's participation on this webinar, and especially to thank again the Ebony, Emily, and Sarah team who did this work. And I'm going to ask my colleague if she also has any concluding questions, but before I do that, or comments, but before I do that, I also wanted to invite anybody on this webinar who'd like to talk with us more about what we want to do with this next or how to think about it. Please reach out. You know, this is not the completion of the work. This is sort of the commencement of the work.
I just wanted to add my thank you to the team at the Center for Community Solutions, and also my thank you to the people in the chat. We can't see you, but we very much appreciate your very thoughtful questions that in and of themselves advance the work. So thank you.
Great. So you have in the chat the link where things will be available for viewing later today, the slides and the recording, which is great. And thank you all for attending. Thank you for the work that you're doing and your interest in this particular topic. Thanks to Deaconess for sponsoring the research and for joining us today on the webinar. And I think with that, we will give you some time back in your Friday afternoon. Have a great day.